All right, welcome everyone to Pasadena City College Hixon Teacher Prep Teacher Talk. I'm super excited to welcome PCC's own history faculty, Francesca Chaboya. Excuse me for the voice, I'm just getting over a little cold, but what I'll be doing is introducing our speaker, facilitating Q&A. So please, as you listen to the great information, post your questions into the chat. Hopefully we'll have you share through the mic if you're comfortable to do so, etc. But thank you so much. And then make sure you stick around to the very end because I'll go over a couple of other important Hixon opportunities. But I do want to introduce our history faculty. Francesca Chaboya has been working in higher education for almost 10 years. She began serving students as an academic counselor and transitioned into teaching history at the college level almost 8 years ago. She's had the opportunity to work at multiple community colleges within Southern California and also spent a brief amount of time teaching grades 6 through 12. She currently is at Pasadena City College teaching Mexican American and US history while also teaching within the dual enrollment program. And that tends to be teaching also high school students who are taking college courses. Her focus as an educator is to humanize the past while thinking about the concepts of identity, space, and rhetoric, all themes that can be applicable to any field of study. So with that, I'll let you take it away, but thank you so much. And again, folks, I'll stop sharing my screen. Please feel free to chime in with questions, etc. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, let's see. I am trying to, you know what? I'm on my work computer, so it's not letting me share my screen. Let me log into my regular computer, but I'll multitask. So as I'm doing that and multitasking, I'll talk a little bit about what I am going to be talking about today. So like was said in the introduction, I am going to be speaking about identity and intersectionality and rhetoric. And to give you a little bit of background about me, as you know, as was said in the intro, I do currently teach at PCC, but I've had opportunities to teach in grades 6 through 12. I'm also currently teaching at the dual enrollment program. So I'm at John Muir teaching 11th graders at the moment. And also I have just really been passionate about education my entire life. So I really knew from an early point that I wanted to be in education. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be an educator, what it means to work in education, and the importance of education as a whole. So I was really excited for this opportunity. And you know, my personal experience with education really derived from my parents telling me that that was my way to boost my career and like I was going to make lots of money if I was going to get an education. But it has since changed, and I really am passionate about the opportunities of being able to hear different voices and hear different experiences, and just being introduced to a whole new world with education. So that's why I'm very passionate about education. So I'm multitasking. Sorry, give me one moment as I log in from my work computer so that I could share my screen. Let's see.
No worries. And let me know if you need me to stall with anything.
Yeah. Actually, if I send you my PowerPoint, is that?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
No worries.
And
as you're doing that, I just want to welcome again everybody. I see some familiar names, some of Education 13 students, some of our Hixon Future Teachers of Color cohort, some former folks who have been in all sorts of internships. Hiroko, nice to see you in this space. For folks who are not part of the Hixon Teacher Prep Program and somehow along the way you found the flyer for this, I'm going to drop the link to the Hixon application towards the end of today. And so please make sure that you sign up so that we can get you all the announcements and all of the different opportunities that are coming our way. You can also email me the PowerPoint, or you can also, I think, drop it into the Zoom chat if you're wanting to share it with everybody or just myself.
I just shared it with you now.
Okay. Give me 1 second to see. Sometimes email takes a little bit of time. And while I'm getting this set up, I'm not sure if you're going to speak a little bit to your experience working with the 6th through 12th graders. A lot of the students in this space are interested in teaching elementary.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually going to request access. It says it's, there we go.
So yes, I will speak to that. My experience teaching in 6th through 12th and the dual enrollment program right now, I really had to obviously shift the way that I think about education, being in a higher ed space, moving into other grades as well. But really, when we think about these concepts of identity and we think about these concepts of rhetoric and space, there's a common misconception that we cannot introduce these concepts into these lower grades, or we cannot share these complex components with a lower grade. But we just have to be creative with it. And I'll share some ways that I have been able to kind of change the way that I talk about these concepts and being able to introduce them into a lower grade. So I apologize again for my own mishap. With my computer.
All right. Are you all able to see it? I know it's still loading on my end, but.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
And I again apologize for that delay. So like I said, I'm going to be speaking about identity, intersectionality, and rhetoric, and really how it applies to ethnic studies in the classroom. This image here is one of my favorite that I've found. I also teach Mexican American history, so I spend a lot of time talking about the Chicano movement. And so this kind of speaks to the Chicano movement specifically, but my goal with this discussion is to really talk about these concepts, how they apply to history, yes, but how they just generally apply to different spaces that we move in. So whether it be the classroom, if you're an educator, or if you're pursuing, working in the space of education, or even if it just applies to your day-to-day life, your personal life, your work outside of education, I'm going to try to bring all of those pieces together and really talk about what these concepts mean and help us understand what they mean. So what I'm going to be doing is helping us define and understand identity, intersectionality, and rhetoric. Also, like I said, how it's relevant to spaces we move in, including the classroom. But I'm also going to talk about why do we even bother with these discussions? And I think this is a big question that I get the most. Why do you spend so much time obsessing about these concepts? So I'll speak a little bit to that. And also, like I said, for you educators, I will share some ideas of how I personally have used these concepts in the classroom at the higher ed level, but also in grades 6 through 12 as well. So understanding identity, when we talk about identity, what we're really talking about are different qualities and identity markers that make an individual. So when we think about this, we're really thinking about the different ways in which our environment, our background, our heritage impacts the individual. And it can be very complex, and it can include a variety of markers. So obviously every single individual is different. Their experience is different, their background is different, where they come from is different. And sometimes there can be a disconnect between how an individual sees themselves versus how the outside world sees them. So, for example, one of the examples that I usually share is when I was younger, I remember at one point someone telling me that I was Spanish. And I kept saying, no, I'm not Spanish. I am Mexican. And that's what I said. And they said, well, you speak Spanish, so it's the same thing. And I thought, well, no, it's not the same thing to me, because I'm thinking Spain, from Spain equals Spanish, Mexican, my family's from Mexico. So that's how I, saw myself. But again, that small example kind of shows how there can be a disconnect between how an individual perceives them, but also how the outside world sees the individual. And that could be based on physical appearance. It could be based on where they lived. It could be based on, the language that they speak. All of those reasons could be why there is that disconnect. So it's important to understand that each individual has the individual markers that very specifically speak to them. So we can share a similar background, but identify as completely two different people. So when thinking about these examples of identity markers, we can think of a number of different ones. So race and ethnicity, of course, is one. Gender can be one as well. Sexuality can be another one. Social class can be another one, and physical ability can be another. But we're not just limited to these identity markers. There's many more identity markers beyond that. And like I said, for each individual, it can be different. And maybe one particular identity marker relates to them the most, or maybe multiple. So for example, if you really embrace your ethnicity, that might be the identity marker that speaks to you the most, or a combination of gender and ethnicity speaks to me the most. And so that's what I embrace the most when it comes to my identity. So everyone's different. And that's why I was saying before, you can have similar backgrounds, but maybe have different identities, right? So you can be impacted by your heritage, by your environment. Like for example, if you live in a particular neighborhood, maybe that impacts your identity as well. So that's what I mean, how it can also be impacted by your environment. And I do want to speak to this image on the screen really quick. This image here was by an artist. This exhibit was at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach. And the artist that had this piece on display, in the explanation, the artist talked about how she very specifically felt like there was multiple parts to her identity. And she felt like she was always trying to sort of balance those different parts of her identity in her life. And so I thought it was very relevant to what we're talking about here, because ultimately that is something that an individual may deal with, right? Trying to balance all of those components of their identity. And so the big thing about identity also is that it really impacts how you move into different spaces. How do you represent yourself in these various spaces that you are in and out of? And so the two examples that I have here, one is at a 4th of July parade, another is at a movement for Indigenous Peoples Day. And in both images, we really see these different symbols that are related to identity, right? On 4th of July, you see a lot of people wearing red, white, and blue. There's a lot of American flags, and there's this attachment to that American identity. On the left-hand side, you see another movement in support of Indigenous Peoples Day, and there's people with symbols, attire, different clothing, different jewelry or instruments that are representative of that Indigenous identity. And so that's why understanding identity is so important, is because it really helps us understand why people move in these spaces in the way that they do. And also it impacts, how they carry themselves in these spaces. And here's another example as well. So this is actually from one of the first celebrations of Dia de los Muertos in Los Angeles. This organization, Self-Help Graphics, which still hosts the Dia de los Muertos celebration. And this particular celebration that they host yearly, again, since the 70s, was a way to reach out to Mexican communities, but then it started really expanding from there into other communities of color and other Latina communities as well. And so again, in these spaces, we see how identity impacts the individual. They're dressed a certain way, they have certain materials, they, of course, contribute to the ofrenda or the altars for Dia de los Muertos. So it really impacts how they are moving in these spaces and are participating in these certain events as well. In this case, we're looking at, this is an example of a movement, a peace rally in which in the 1970s, Asian Americans really came together collectively, embracing this common identity under the umbrella of being Asian American. And so this is another component of the complexity of identity, is that sometimes we see this unification under this, in this case, under the term of Asian American, right? So instead of individually embracing being Korean or being Chinese, for this particular moment in history in this movement, there was this intent to unify under this identity of being Asian because they wanted to successfully come together and advocate for a common cause that they saw was relevant across various Asian identities. So it was one of the first times where we really saw people being unified under this common identity of being Asian American with a very specific cause for civil rights for Asian Americans. And of course, I had to include the Black Panther Party as well, also really embracing the identity of their being Black, embracing their Blackness, not trying to stray away from any cultural components that really highlighted their Black heritage. So not trying to not to change hairstyles, not trying to change the way that they talked, dressing a particular way that very much so demonstrated to the world around them that they were Black, and embracing that Black identity. And so in all of these examples that I've given, the common thread that we see here is, by understanding that individual's identity, we can understand the decisions that they make in their day-to-day life. Why do they dress a certain way? Why do they engage in certain movements? Why do they support certain movements? Why do they advocate for very specific goals within society? And especially when we're talking about ethnic studies and we're talking about history, understanding that is very important, right? It really helps us humanize these moments in history rather than just thinking of them as these, dates that we see in textbooks, right? It really humanizes that experience. And so that's why I typically spend a lot of time thinking about identity, because it really helps us humanize these experiences, these events, and these moments in history. And so on the topic of intersectionality, this is a term that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw And she is a woman who spoke on how these different identity markers really overlap and impact the individual. So she gives this example of an intersection like I have on the screen here. So for example, a person's race can overlap with their sexuality. So their experience, as she very specifically speaks about Black women. So for example, the experience of being Black on top of the experience of being a woman impacts Black women differently than it would other women of color or a Black man, right? Because a Black woman is being impacted by systems of discrimination that impact women very specifically based on their gender, or also systems of discrimination that very specifically impact Black Americans as a whole. So this overlapping of these experiences with these systems of discrimination or oppression impact that individual in a very unique way. And so on the next slide, there's a picture that you'll see in a moment. This is a movement for women's suffrage movement that very specifically spoke to Black women, because Black women were experiencing voting suppression in the early 1900s, not only because they were women, since women were not permitted the right to vote until the 1920s, but also because of the restrictions placed on Black Americans through things like poll taxes, literacy tests. And so Black women had the experience of being oppressed due to their gender, but also because of their race. So that's why it's important to think about intersectionality, is because, you know, these two systems of oppression based discrimination because of race and discrimination of gender are overlapping and impacting the individual in that unique way. And so, of course, this can also be applicable to other women of color. And so it's not unique just to Black women only, but of course can be introduced into other women of color. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, Vietnamese women spoke about sort of the sexualization of Vietnamese women. So again, being impacted by being Vietnamese, but also being a woman. During the Chicano movement, women talked about being sort of impacted by the machismo of Mexican culture. And so having to deal with being Mexican, but also having to deal with, you know, oppression due to their gender. And also, you know, it doesn't just, we're not just limited to gender and race. It can also include, you know, your affirmed gender. It can also include sexuality. It can include ability. There's a number of different ways that we can see these identity markers overlap. And so when we think about identity and intersectionality, again, our big picture is really trying to understand how people are moving in the spaces that they are based on how these identity markers impact them. And also what we can look at when we're thinking about identity is the impact of rhetoric. So the way that I typically define rhetoric is the practice of communication that reinforces beliefs, values, or action. And when I talk about rhetoric, what I'm very specifically referencing is anything that is visual. It could be printed, it could be verbal, but it's like these reoccurring themes that we see as long as they're methods of communication. And they're created with the intent of sending a very clear message. So I chose this poster here because it says, "Si se puede," and the intent of the artist here was supposed to mimic the Rosie the Riveter poster from World War II, but to very specifically speak to Chicana women. And he chose this image of the Adelita, who is sort of this romanticized image of women during the Mexican Revolution. But this image is meant to send this message of empowerment. And the message of si se puede is also this phrase, yes, we can, that's associated with empowerment. And so if you see the sort of this iconic stance, most people associate this with women empowerment. If you see these different colors, most people associate those colors related to Mexican culture. The phrase si se puede is actually also relevant to the United Farm Workers movement that was coined by Dolores Huerta. So you have these reoccurring themes that overall are meant to send this message of empowerment. So if I see something like this, the first thing that comes to mind is the empowerment of women. So it's reinforcing sort of this idea and this movement that's related to empowerment. And then another example is the MMIW movement, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement, which is trying to bring awareness to Indigenous women who have gone missing or who have been murdered and whose crimes have been unsolved. And so there's this imagery of the red handprint. And on the left-hand side is a runner, an Indigenous runner, Jordan Daniel, who ran with this handprint that was, as you can see, painted on her face with the intent of sending this message that she was bringing awareness to this movement. And then on the right-hand side, we see this painting with the same handprint over the woman who's depicted in the image. So again, the reoccurring theme here is, first off, the color red, and of course, handprint over the mouth that is meant to reinforce sort of this message of trying to bring awareness of how Indigenous women have gone missing, how Indigenous women are being murdered at a higher rate. And when you see this image, it really brings your attention and you start to resonate that message with this image. So it could be a number of symbols when we're talking about rhetoric. It could be certain phrases. I said earlier, like, yes, we can, right? That's a reoccurring sort of phrase that we see in a lot of campaigns. So it could be a number of different things. We're not just limited to images. It could be symbols. It could be print. We're really not limited as long as it's a method of communication. So now that we kind of covered what those concepts mean, and I really threw a lot at you, I want to talk a little bit about how these concepts are relevant in the spaces that we move in. So number one thing, when I think about how I apply these concepts in a day-to-day experience, and very specifically for me as an educator, it helps me stay conscious of my own identity. So, when I think of my own identity, I embrace my identity markers of being, a woman, being Chicana, being an educator. And so in saying that, it really impacts how I maneuver through the spaces that I move through. When I'm in the classroom, I'm conscious of that identity. How do I carry myself? What message am I trying to relay to others? When I am in public spaces, I may maneuver a different way because I'm not really like in my education role, but I'm still conscious of my other identity markers, like the fact that I am a woman and the fact that I am Chicana, right? So in general, I try to be conscious of my own identity when I'm in these spaces. And also, the reality is that when we are in the classroom as educators, or when we're just maneuvering in public spaces daily, there are these moments when we are consistently reminded that we are impacted by our identities. So on the next slide, I have a couple examples of comments that reminded me of my identity. So some comments that I've received that made me very conscious and very aware of my identity was, do I speak English? I remember one of the first times I went onto a new campus, that was one of the first questions that I got. And so again, it made me conscious of my identity of being a brown woman. Another question that I typically get is, or I don't typically get, but I've gotten in the past, are you legal? Same thing. It made me very conscious of my identity. The next question that really had an impact on my decision to pursue a career in education was when I was in high school. My school counselor told me, don't apply to college because statistically Latinas are prone to drop out in their first year. So he told me not to apply to college for that reason. I didn't listen. I did apply to college and I still went, but it really made me conscious of the fact that in these spaces, including spaces of education, the way that I'm perceived is my identity is going to impact the way that I am perceived, right? So that made me very conscious of my identity in education. When one of the first years that I started teaching, I got a student that approached me and said, I'm dropping your class because I don't like being taught by someone younger than me. And then he said, but not because you're a woman. And both of those comments also reminded me how my identity is impacting the spaces that I'm moving in, right? So I have to be conscious of this. And the reality is that both of those last two comments very specifically really made me think about how am I going to move in the world of education? Because both of those situations were in situations where I thought I would, be considered as, or at least that maybe perhaps my identity would not really impact the way I was perceived by others, including, my counselor, right? But the reality is that I was being impacted by those identity markers. So first and foremost, it helps me be conscious of how my identity is reflected to the outside world, but also how do I carry myself in these spaces because of that. And so because of those experiences, especially in education and especially as an educator, I tried to be conscious of other people's identity because I am very aware that there are other students that may have those same experiences or have similar experiences or maybe worse experiences, right? So I have to be conscious that if I've experienced that in my own spaces of education, most likely there are students that have other situations in which they've had an experience that was a reflection of their identity. And that is always in the back of their mind, right? So when they enter my classroom, I'm trying to stay conscious of they could have gone through a number of things. Maybe they're also thinking about that one thing someone said to them that was attached to their identity. So by being conscious of that, my hope is that I can then create a space in my classroom that regardless of that experience or regardless of their identity, they are going to be welcomed, they're going to be accepted, and that there's not going to be any type of negative connection attached to their identity, right? So by being conscious of my own identity, it helps me stay conscious of others' identity as well. And so the two combined really helps me stay conscious of bias in different spaces. This includes, the classroom, this includes spaces of education, but this also includes other spaces beyond the classroom and beyond school. So whether you are pursuing a field in education or not, I think this is relevant to anyone. And especially as we're moving in the direction as a whole, as a society, we're thinking about how can we create equitable spaces. it's important to be conscious of that bias, right? Be conscious of these identities. And so directly when we think about rhetoric, I'm also thinking about the rhetoric that I use in my spaces, in my classroom very specifically. So, simple things like, using the word Latina, which is non-binary, right? That simple just change in language lets my students know that I am conscious of the potential of having students that are non-binary, right? And so simple changes like that in our language just creates a more inclusive space. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that, right? Another example that I give in my history classes very specifically is just talking about Black Americans being enslaved rather than slaves, right? Making that clear difference just speaks to the power and also the experiences of Black Americans in US history. And so again, these may seem like very insignificant or small changes in our rhetoric and language, but they all add up, right? And it also creates a space of inclusivity and also empowers our students as well, especially if you're in a field of education. But in general, in any space, that can be empowering for the people around you. And so why do we choose to understand these concepts related to identity? So, the main reason that I think about identity and rhetoric, and like I said at the beginning, I have been really thinking about this literally for decades. But the reason why I think about this is because I want to create a space in the classroom that is hopefully very communal. I want to contribute to creating a community within the classroom, a community on campus as a whole. But also, this can be applicable to spaces outside of the classroom as well. And by creating this community, I'm hoping of creating a community of support, hoping that students feel supported and they feel as though they, have a voice or an opportunity to share their voice in the classroom. Also, just to speak to a personal experience, in one of my middle school classes that I taught, I shared a clip of Selena Quintanilla singing, and I think it was just for Hispanic Heritage Month. And one of my students turned to me and said, "This is the first time that I've, seen a Latina singer in my classroom." And she got really excited, and it really kind of shifted the way that she interacted in my classroom. Like, she was more attentive and she was more outspoken, and she felt like she can kind of come to me with ideas of what she wanted to talk about. And it was just simply showing like one little clip for Hispanic Heritage Month that really just completely shifted the way that she thought about the classroom space. Another example is I have talked about in my dual enrollment class about biracial communities. And same thing, another student, shared that was the first time that she had heard something like that in the classroom, something that she felt like she could relate to. And again, it really shifted her perspective of the classroom as a whole. And so these little moments, again, add up to these moments of support, these moments of empowerment. And then in turn, it makes it easier to make that space the collaborative space as well, so that it's not just a one-sided point of view being contributing to the classroom, but that it's this inclusive classroom that can be collaborative. And again, it doesn't have to be limited to the classroom. It could be open to any space that you're a part of. And so I did want to this is a picture of Selena Quintanilla that I was talking about. There is a podcast that I recently started listening to that I just wanted to quickly kind of share with you all. The podcast is called Anything for Selena, and the producer talks about how seeing Selena for the first time on television really just changed her whole perspective about the world around her. As someone who herself identified as being Latina and had been criticized for her name, for the way that she talked, for not speaking English perfectly, but also not speaking Spanish perfectly. She saw herself in this singer who was entering these spaces. And it was finally, she felt like she was being represented in pop culture, right? And so when we think about identity in the classroom, especially, like I said, it could be as simple as just showing like a 30-second clip or just showing a picture. It can, just by seeing that representation for the first time, can be really empowering. And also, I wanted to just give you a couple more examples. This is an artist who is well known, who became well known during the Harlem Renaissance. And Elizabeth Catlett, she really highlighted Black women experiences and sort of unique experiences that really had not been shown to the rest of the world prior. And I mean, in the Harlem Renaissance as a whole, is a whole movement in which we saw all of these Black artists being able to embrace Black identity and share Black experiences. And very similar to what I was saying before, you know, it was this moment of empowerment for Black Americans across the nation to finally feel like they were being represented in art, in literature, in music, and seeing for that for the first time really built this sense of solidarity across the nation. And I also had to share one of my favorite quotes by another artist who was a writer, ZORA Neale Hurston. This is one of her quotes by a short story called How It Feels to Be Colored Me. And one of my favorite quotes from this piece is she says, "I am not tragically colored. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife, the world to be won and nothing to be lost." And so the reason why I chose this quote is because one of the biggest questions that I sometimes get when I teach ethnic studies very specifically is, you know, why do you teach it? Like, one of the biggest arguments that I see is, you know, why do you want to tell people that they're victims? That's the biggest thing that I always hear. And what ZORA Neale Hurston is saying here is really speaking to the fact that by embracing her Blackness does not make her feel like she's tragically Black, right? She sees it as this moment of empowerment, and sees it as this moment of understanding her history to see what she can do in the future. And so by understanding our identities as a whole is not necessarily this moment to think about identity in a way that makes us victims, right? It's definitely a moment of empowerment, understanding the world around you, understanding how the world around you impacts you and others, right? It's this moment of empowerment. And so how can we apply these concepts in the classrooms? I have some examples of how I specifically have used these concepts in the classroom, and I put some examples here in my from my 6 through 12 classes. So this first one here on the next slide is an activity that I had my 6th graders do. Actually, I had my 6th, 8th, and 11th graders do. And I had them create a student profile. And so this is mine that I shared with them. And so it was just my student profile, or their student profile, but my example, of course, their name, some interests and hobbies. And then I just asked them, you know, what is their identity markers? And we briefly kind of talked about what identity markers were, what it means, what can impact an identity marker. And then I shared my own so that they would understand what I was talking about. And I asked them, what some important spaces to them, and then 3 symbols or images that represent them. And so this is just a way to get them thinking about identity and spaces as well, and different symbols. So we're thinking about rhetoric as well. And, my 6th graders loved it. It gave them a lot of creativity and an opportunity to share about themselves. Other things that I've done at the middle school level, as well as in my classroom for Black History Month, I put up different images. I made them like Instagram posts. So like the captions read or had different descriptions of each moment in Black history. And it was on display in the classroom, and they had an opportunity to look at it. And then I gave them the opportunity, if they wanted to, they could create their own Instagram post and bring it in as well. And we would put it on the wall. So again, it's just another way to kind of open that door to talk about identity. And it allowed the students to get creative with it as well. This one is another one that I did. And these are for my younger students as well. So you could, transfer over to really any age group. Is for AAPI Heritage Month. They picked an individual historical or cultural political figure of the AAPI community and wrote about them. And some of them chose to draw a picture. Some of them chose to print out a picture. And the same thing, they got really creative with it and really liked it. And then we put it on display in the classroom. For my older students, my 11th graders, I also did a Black History Month celebration where the first 3 to 5 minutes of class, I just showed them a clip or a newspaper article or a piece of art that related to different political and historical and cultural figures, and just spend some time talking about them. And again, it doesn't even have to relate to history. Like I included, athletes, I included singers and artists. It just introduced these different voices, these different identities in the classroom. And it really, I started to see it sparked a lot of questions for my students as well. And then they got curious also and wanted to talk about Black artists or Black athletes that they knew as well. And just to share another quick story, one of my 8th graders, she was very quiet, very shy. She had trouble speaking up in other classes. When she had the opportunity to do an extra credit assignment for Black History Month, to my surprise, she came forward and she volunteered herself to do this extra credit assignment that she didn't have to do, but she did it because she was excited that she knew a Black artist that she could speak on. And so, it really opened her up as a student in my class. And like I was saying before, it was really this moment of empowerment. Other things that you can do for younger students as well, I think I saw some elementary education, is I've had students draw themselves, how they represent, how they see themselves, and just doing little things like that. So like I said, although these concepts are really complex, the way that we speak about them in the classroom doesn't necessarily have to be, this level of complexity. So that's all I have.
Awesome. This is so great. Folks, we have about maybe 5 or so minutes, maybe 6, to pose some questions. So I'd love if you can go into the chat, every single one of you, to either post a thought, anything that you're taking with you from today's talk, or pose a question. If you can do that in the next minute or so. And then we can also open it up to, if anybody wants to use the mic and pose a question, we can do that now. And both Francesca and I are educators, so we're just going to do the waiting method. We're going
Yeah.
to wait for someone to
I know.
post a
I'm
question
not
or to
shy
use
to
the
wait.
mic. Not at all.
I know I threw a lot at you all.
Okay, so here, something I learned in my Education 13 class was that with diversity in the school system, different race, ethnicity, diverse abilities, children will feel represented. I love the different ways you come up with different activities for each of your grade levels. I think there's a little bit of a delay as folks are typing in. Somebody sent a question here. Is it ever difficult to talk about identity in the classroom? Have you ever had any challenges in that work with young folks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, when we talk about identity, it's obviously very personal, right? And of course, it can be even triggering or traumatic for some, right? So that's why I think it's really important, by understanding identity, and we are conscious of our own identity, we can bring those experiences to the classroom as well, to stay conscious of how we approach these issues. But the most important thing I would say is really to be conscious of everyone's identity in the classroom, regardless of background, regardless of who they are, to make sure everyone understands that you are hearing them all, that you see them all. That's really important. And, people tend to want to shy away from speaking about these things. And it's like that first initial step can be scary. The first time I did it in the classroom as an educator, trust me, I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen. But when you finally take that leap, it really opens up a really wonderful door, not to be like, super cliche, but it really opens up this space where you'll be surprised by how the students react. So I think if we're just conscious of each other in those spaces, and just ourselves as educators have to be brave enough to take that leap, it really can open up that door. But I agree, it is difficult. It can be scary because, it's complicated. But if you just kind of trust yourself and be mindful of everyone, you can do it.
Yeah, other folks are just chiming in, and feel free to pose questions, folks, but lots of observations here. Thank you so much for the connections. Somebody saying that they're starting to see the connections between what they learned here with their other classes. Some folks are saying this helped them understand how identity is broken down. And I do want to kind of just add on to what you said about this idea that like educators should be engaging in these types of conversations and activities. And what often happens is sometimes teacher education programs don't necessarily have that lens. Many do, and you do have to kind of shop around for them. But so much of our preparation as educators is also understanding just people and identities and who people are. And so I'm always telling folks, like, even if you're majoring in elementary education or liberal studies, like take ethnic studies courses, take women's studies courses. It's going to shape your teaching for the better. And I think that should also be part of your preparation for it. Mm-hmm. Lots of comments here, folks. Does anybody we have time for one more question. Does anybody have a question they want to pose?
I did get a question, so I'll read it out loud. How do you help students overcome judgment from others because of their identity? That's a great question. What I try to do is I try to open up the classroom as a space where it's very clear that we as a classroom, as a community in the classroom, are going to be respectful of each other's identities. And there has been moments in my classes where that has come up, where difference in identity or difference in point of view has kind of escalated. But in my opinion, and this is what I did in my classroom, it's my responsibility to kind of mediate that and very clearly establish that every identity is accepted, every point of view. We can differ, but we have to be respectful of each other. And so again, it's one of those moments that I don't think school necessarily always prepares us for, that we have to act as sort of those mediators in the classroom. You know, that we just have to just make sure that we're open to taking that stance and saying, again, I see you, I hear you, everyone is welcome. And if there's any moments where there's a sign of someone feeling unwelcome, I try to shut that down immediately.
Awesome. We have one more question, and I think if we can pose that one, and then we're just going to have a couple of announcements. Thank you, folks, for sticking around a little longer. After introducing the class to the concept of identity markers, do you think the students embrace diversity more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think also, like I was saying before, being mindful of the rhetoric and the language that I use in the classroom as well has been helpful. I remember very particularly in one of my 11th grade classes, I had a student who was doing a presentation that was very specifically related to a community of color. And when he was asked a question, he started to say something, and then I saw him stop himself and think about how he wanted to say the sentence moving forward. And I could see on his face and sort of his whole process that he changed his language. And so just by setting that example and by letting your students know that you are mindful of those identity markers and that you're mindful of your own language, just by setting that example, your students will pick up on that. And especially even the younger ones, you know, the same thing. I've seen the same thing in my sixth graders that I had also. So absolutely, if you introduce it and you mimic it, they will see your example and follow.
Awesome. I know there's a couple questions we didn't get around to, folks, but thank you so much. If you, I'm not sure, Professor Chaboya, if you're able to leave your email for folks
Yes,
there.
absolutely.